Good evening, I'm Rocky Hill and I'm director here, and we're going to talk tonight kind of about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now in my own personal life. So you're going to hear a little bit about what transpired in my own addiction in the 14 years that I spent in the research and development field of addiction. I started out in one of those families that looked like Ozzie and Harriet. Lived on an Air Force base. Mom was PTA president. Mom was Officers' Wives Club president. My dad was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. I was raised on an Air Force base. Everything looked from the outside great. We had some issues, but I don't know that there were any more issues than any other family. What I do know is that I learned in that family that there were certain things you didn't do, and one of those things was to cry. One of those things was to talk about being afraid of anything. One of those things was to talk back to mom or dad. And I learned some things about not telling the secret about dad's drinking and about mom and dad fighting. So there are certain things that I learned that I didn't even really know that I learned. But what I found was, to fast forward a little bit, at age 16, I was at a military school in New Mexico. And for the first time, I got intoxicated. And it was magic. You know, we were, some guys had suggested that we go up to Clovis, New Mexico, and they had some tall boy Colt 45s. Don't ever drink that. And we were going to go up to Clovis and chase women around, chase girls around, not women, girls. And drink tall boy Colt 45s and get drunk and have a good time. And it was an interesting thing because as I started drinking those tall boy Colt 45s, I started getting taller, smarter, better looking. It was easier for me to talk to people. All of a sudden, I wasn't thinking about what I was going to say. I was just saying it. And everything I said was funny, was entertaining, was profound. All of a sudden, I fit in my own skin. And that was magic. And so, of course, if I'd had 3, then, you know, a good addict 3 times 4 is 4 times as good. And so I continued to drink, and the next thing I knew, I was wedged somehow between the base of a toilet and the wall. And I'd vomited all over this friend's parents' house, all over their bathroom, and I felt embarrassed, I felt humiliated, I felt sick. And yet, you know, it was interesting because the next weekend, somebody said, "Hey, do you want to go get drunk and chase women?" Now, I don't think I ever saw a woman the whole time we were out there, but I said, "Yeah, that sounds good." And that's that whole idea, that concept we've mentioned before of euphoric recall. Because what my head threw back to me was, man, I had a good time. You know, I laughed, I was tall enough, I was smart enough, I was good looking enough, all that kind of stuff. And I fit. And I could communicate. That distance between me and other people all of a sudden went away. Because I always had a lot of friends. I played football, I played baseball, I was part of student government. I had associates, I had people that I knew. But I don't know that I ever had any friends, because nobody ever got to know who I really was. They saw the mask that said, "This is who I am." In the fraternity, they called me Cocky Rocky, because I'd jump out of windows and I'd get in fights in bars and things like that. Because I couldn't imagine anybody would ever suspect that I might be afraid to do anything. So the outside said, "I'm not afraid of anything," and screw you and the horse you rode in on. The inside was, "I'm not good enough the way I am." And alcohol made that, bridged that, brought those two together. And that was a profound, magical moment for me. Because I remembered that. All of a sudden I knew why my dad drank. I knew why he drank his martinis and Manhattans. Because it did the same thing for him that it did for me. But I swore I was never going to do drugs. I was never going to succumb to that. And I went up to Oklahoma State University from the military school in New Mexico, and I joined fraternity, and I started drinking. And Wednesday evening we'd start drinking, and Sunday morning we'd roll into the fraternity house. And I remember sitting there on the fraternity house steps looking up and watching the fraternity brothers that were the president and the good guys in the fraternity, the non-partiers, taking the house mother to church. I remember looking at them and thinking, man, if they knew what a good time we just had, chasing girls around, racing cars, getting in fights, doing all the stuff that's fun and that men are supposed to do, they'd be doing what we're doing. And I went on like that for a while at Oklahoma State, didn't go to classes, got behind in my school, and decided, we went to, I guess my first use of drugs was marijuana, no big deal, smoked a little bit of weed. This is like 1969, wasn't a big problem. Nothing happened. Then there was Jimi Hendrix concert at OU, went to OU, did some LSD, no big deal. Hair didn't grow all over me, didn't jump out of a window. And I thought, those people just don't want you to have a good time, whoever those people are that say don't do drugs. You just need to be able to do it in moderation, do it recreationally. And certainly I was a moderate kind of guy, I could do that. And so I continued to do a little marijuana here, a little bit of LSD here, there. And then I, again, was behind in school, and so somebody said, well, you can do some speed, and that'll keep you up all night and you can study. And so first time I did speed, it was like, boom, all of a sudden I could concentrate, I could stay up all night, get that paper done. I never went to class, so I could study everything I was supposed to study for the test, get ready, and as long as I was still doing the speed, I could go right in and take the test or do the paper. And ultimately, I graduated from Oklahoma State with the help of chemicals. Now the problem with methamphetamine or with speed was that it wouldn't let me get back to sleep then. And I discovered this drug called Quaaludes. And Quaaludes were perfect for me. Speed made me too nervous, made me anxious. I was already kind of turned up too high anyway as far as I was concerned. And this kind of dampened me down. It kind of tempered it. It slowed me down. And I liked that. And it was a disinhibitor, it was like alcohol without the hangover. And that was a perfect combination for me. I had one little bauble at Oklahoma State. I was arrested for possession of marijuana with intent to sell. And they caught me with a couple of bags of weed and under the seat of my car, and I was guilty. But my dad was well connected in the state, and my fraternity brother's dad was state senator, and so they got me out of it. And they didn't get me out of my disease; they got me out of that legal jam. Ultimately, they missed an opportunity. They missed an opportunity because the district attorney wanted to send me to McAllister State Penitentiary, and because it was first drug bust in Stillwater, Oklahoma, for possession with intent to sell. But they missed that opportunity to get some seeds planted for me. In any case, I continued at Oklahoma State, changed majors a couple times, grades didn't go up, got addicted to Quaaludes, had varying kinds of problems, automobile accidents, fights, things like that. But finally left Oklahoma State and had degrees in psychology and sociology, and had an addiction to methaqualone, Quaaludes. And I had bottles of Quaaludes. A friend of mine his dad had a pharmaceutical warehouse in Oklahoma City, and I had bottles of Quaaludes. And I'd just take 4, 5, 6, 10 a day. And I always thought that, someday I was gonna get happy. And that happiness was contingent on having horses, having a ranch house, having a big fireplace, and a pretty wife. And when I had those things on the outside, then the inside was going to feel all right. And that sense of emptiness and inadequacy and loneliness that I felt inside was going to go away based on those things I was able to get on the outside. And I had all those things. I had a nice ranch house outside Oklahoma City and a pretty wife and, a big fireplace and horses and all that stuff. And I was still doing Quaaludes. And finally, the federal government decided that Quaaludes weren't as non-addictive as they thought. And so they started clamping down, and so I decided I was going to come off the Quaaludes, and so I just quit taking the Quaaludes. And I remember my wife thought I had the flu, and in fact, I told her that I had the flu, and we had a big blue reclining chair in front of the fireplace, and I laid down in that reclining chair, and she felt sorry for me, so she went in and made a pound cake, and she brought it back out and gave me a piece, and next thing I know, I'm on the floor, and I look up at her, and she's got blood all over her hand. And I look in the mirror, and I've got blood all over my mouth and down on my shirt. And I realized immediately what had happened. I had worked on federal research papers at Oklahoma State on drug addiction, and I knew that what had happened was I'd had a grand mal seizure. And I flopped around on the ground and chewed up my tongue, and don't ever do this. She thought I was going to swallow my tongue, and she stuck her hand in my mouth, and I chewed up her hand pretty severely as well. So she called the emergency room. They sent an ambulance, picked us up, took us into the emergency room, and they stitched her hand up, and her mom and dad were there, and my dad, and they called down a neurologist and the ER doc, and they're all standing around my gurney trying to figure out, well, what's happened? Why is this seemingly healthy guy? I'd played sports all my life and didn't look like, I guess, what they considered a drug addict to look like, and they're trying to figure out, why did I have a grand mal seizure? And I remember reading an article not too long before that about sugar shock. And so I raised my hand and I said, I think I know what the problem is. I think that Linda put too much sugar in that pound cake, and I think probably I've gone into sugar shock, and that's the problem. And everybody kind of shrugged their shoulders and don't know what it is. And they sent me home with a prescription for Dilantin, which is an anticonvulsant, and for Valium. Well, I already thought I had a Valium deficiency anyway, so that was perfect. I'd go into doctors and say, I have seizure disorder, and the only thing that works is Valium. And so I'd take Valium. As far as I was concerned, Valium wasn't even really a drug. It was just something you took with drugs to boost them. But again, that's the power of that denial. After that seizure, I couldn't even remember how to get home because I was so confused. But my denial was intact. And I knew that if I said, well, guys, I've been doing Quaaludes and I just quit and I had a grand mal seizure, they said, well, then you can't do them anymore. Then don't do them. If I didn't do them, what was I going to do with those feelings? Even though when I left that hospital, I swore to myself I was never going to do Quaaludes again. And yet 6 months later, I was back on Quaaludes, quit again, and sure enough, I had a grand mal seizure again. My tongue had just healed up. My wife's hand had healed up. And sure enough, I chewed up my tongue again. She stuck her hand in my mouth again. And she got stitched up again, and I went back to the emergency room. And this time, we had to do EEGs, CAT scans, all kinds of things because they're thinking brain tumors and whatnot. And that's the power of denial, to say, it's something else. It's anything else but what the problem really is. And I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, and I woke up and I said, oh, drugs are bad, I'm never going to do that again. But it was many more years before I finally got into recovery since then, and barely made it then. And so as time went on, I went through different kinds of problems. And I went to work for the state of Oklahoma as a juvenile parole officer. And kind of started out as their golden boy. They sent me to HEW conferences around the country giving talks on juvenile delinquency planning and prevention. And it made me nervous to have to get up in front of people and talk. And so I would inject a little bit of Seconal and some what we called THC that was PCP. And that'd give me a little creativity plus a little sedation to relax, and it was just right, and I'd get up and give a talk on juvenile delinquency. And that's how my whole life was framed. It all revolved around drugs. My income revolved around drugs, everything. I sold cocaine on the side. I would get up in the morning, and I was a drug abuse expert. One of the judges had recognized my expertise in drug addiction. And so I was a recognized drug abuse expert for the Oklahoma City court system. So when a juvenile came up on charges of drug abuse, they would call me in to testify. And so I would put on my sport coat jacket, jump in my truck or get on my motorcycle, go down to the courthouse, fill up my sport coat with grams of cocaine. And about 10:30, the judge would recess, and usually the 2 district attorneys and 2 public defenders and I would go off in the law library. And it was a nice room that you could close the door. There were no windows. There was a glass-top table, and I would sell them grams of cocaine. And we'd line the cocaine out on the table and snort the cocaine. And we'd talk about those people back in the courtroom that really had a problem. Those people, we were recreational users. We were professionals. We could handle this. Those people obviously couldn't. Now, I can tell you since then, 2 of those guys have gone through treatment with me years ago back in New Mexico. But the reality is that we were no more in control of our addiction than those people in the courtroom. As time went on, things got crazier and crazier. I would leave the courthouse and end up at Chadwick's or VZD's, a couple of clubs in Oklahoma City, and I would sell cocaine, and then I would go pick up a buddy of mine, and he and I would go down on the south side of Oklahoma City and sell speed. And I'd put a revolver in my boot, and And that's how we made a living. And then I'd get up the next morning and go back to work as a juvenile parole officer. And it got crazier and crazier and crazier because I was living a schizophrenic existence of, on the one hand, being scared to death of getting busted, on the other hand, calling for police backup when I needed it. So it was this real chaotic, crazy existence. My wife finally said, enough, I can't do this anymore, and she left, and rightfully so. You know, she didn't know whether she was going to come home from work at night and find me dead, that I'd overdosed, that I'd somehow passed out in the bathtub and was dead, something. And so she finally got tired, and she said, I'm out of here, which just gave me more room and reason to use. I could feel sorry for myself. And so as time went on, I finally, towards the end of my 5 years as a juvenile parole officer, increasingly was getting into more and more problems. And at one point, it seemed I always kept wrecking my truck, and so I would end up having to use the state of Oklahoma big Plymouth. You know, it was a big Plymouth for official use only on the side and the state seal. And I would get in that and drive around, and I had a little yellow Princess phone, and I had hair down to my waist, and I would drive around Oklahoma City in the old big Chrysler. And at some point there was going to be a tournament down at Norman at OU for all the parole and probation officers from throughout the state of Oklahoma. And so I grabbed my bat and glove and ball and a bottle of tequila and some cocaine, and I headed down to Norman to go play in the game. And as I drove up, I see all my bosses and my cohorts out there in the field throwing the ball around. And I thought it would be funny to slide the state car up sideways to the backstop on the gravel. So I revved up the engine and slid up sideways, gravel flying, dust flying. Got out with my bottle of tequila and my bottle and my glove, and that didn't go over real well with the state of Oklahoma. They weren't too happy, so they called me in and threatened to fire me, and I informed them that they weren't going to fire me because I'd snorted cocaine with them. I'd sold cocaine to them, and they didn't want me to go to the Daily Oklahoman and the Oklahoma City Times and talk about how we'd done cocaine together. So that was the last time I heard about addiction. But again, it didn't get me out of my addiction. It just got me out of that jam one more time. And I was able to manipulate and con my way, guilt my way, whatever it took to get out of these situations. But I never could get rid of my disease. Finally, I shrank to 99 pounds, and I decided I needed a detox. And I talked to a psychiatrist, and I checked myself into Baptist Hospital. And it was the locked unit of the psych hospital. And I was in there with some pretty crazy people. And we had one lady that used to just slam her head like this all day. We had my roommate hung himself while I was in there. We had a stripper at the Red Dog Saloon that had slit her wrist up there. And so ultimately, there were no answers there. You know, I remember there was one little old lady that came in, and my roommate had hung himself, and I was real hypersensitive to noise, sound, light, anything. And because I was coming off of about 2,300 milligrams of Placidil plus Valium plus alcohol plus cocaine plus a few other things. And they were cutting my dose in half. And I was there for a total of 10 days, but I was twitching and shaking and nervous and anxious. And one night in the middle of the night, I heard this blood-curdling scream and just hunkered down in my bed and didn't know whether it was real or a hallucination. And next morning I got up and my room opened up to the nurse's station, and they had this observation room with chicken wire in the glass, and they had brought this 89-year-old woman, and she had no teeth, hair frazzled out like this. And as I walk out of my room, I look up, and here's this old lady, and she's got her top off, and she's up against the glass like this, smiling at me with no teeth. And I remember that little woman scared the hell out of me. I didn't know for sure whether I was hallucinating or not, but I knew I was scared to death of that woman. She was about this big, and at some point later, they let her out of the observation room without enough medications, and she came to the cafeteria. And I remember her getting in next to me, and I felt like a dog that didn't want to look at the other dog because it might get in a fight. I was just scared to death of this little old lady. And I went over and I sat down, and she came over and sat down next to me. and kind of smiled at me. And we were having these big Del Monte peach halves, I remember. And she looked over at me and she said, "I want your peach." And I'm trying to be cool. And I said, "Now, Bertha," or whatever, Ethel, I can't remember what her name was, "you need to go get your own peach." I would have given her my car. I didn't care. Just anything, leave me alone. But I was going to be cool. And she just smiled at me, and she turned over and we stabbed my peach with the plastic fork they gave us, and she threw the peach in her mouth, and I looked over at her, and she was going, and peach juice is running all over. And I remember thinking, oh my God, how did I get in here? And time went on, and that was, ultimately those 10 days were the longest 10 days of my life. And yet I got no answers in that period of time. There was nothing that ultimately changed. The psychiatrist and the resident and the intern would meet with me every day, and they'd say, okay. And at one point their treatment plan was to take me down to one of the clubs I used to go to and teach me how to drink socially. That was their treatment plan. And that didn't even make sense to me at that time. But finally I got out of there and I left, and I was committed to not do drugs. And I started drinking, of course, because alcohol isn't really a drug in my estimation at that time. And so the next thing I knew, I was right back to doing the drugs again. And it was getting worse and worse. And so I decided, I need to leave Oklahoma. Oklahoma's my problem. And if I can get out to California, everybody in California is happy. They all run on the beach every day in their shorts. They pick grapefruit out of their backyard. And all the people in California are happy. I'd seen Sprite commercials and stuff like that, and I was convinced of that. So I got on a plane, left my truck in the bank parking lot, and I took off for California. My mom owned a motel in Palm Springs, and she turned a unit over to me, and I just took one of those units. So I was basically, had gone from having a nice house, horses, and a wife, and all the things that I thought I wanted, to having nothing. And my mom bought me an old beat-up Volkswagen, and I got a job as a head counselor in a group home in Palm Desert. And I would go to work every day, and I'd stick a couple bottles of wine into the seat of the car. And I'd get to the job and sneak out to the carport in the middle of the day and drink that hot wine. And believe me, in Palm Desert in August, it's not chilled wine. And I'd get that wine down, stay down below the windowsill so nobody could see me, and I'd get enough wine into my system to make the shakes go away. And my stomach was getting hard and locking up, and finally somebody saw me, and the director of the program called me into the office, and he said, "Rock, you're drinking in the carport of a group home, and you're fired." But he said, and I tried all my best stuff. I tried guilting him, how can you think that of me? I tried threatening, intimidating him. I said, "I'm going to sue you, you can't call me an alcoholic," all that kind of stuff. Didn't work. But he said something real important, and that important thing was, if you'll go to treatment, you can get your job back. And so my decision was, I'm going to go to treatment. I know what that's about. I know. I've been to the psych hospital. There weren't any answers there. But I'm going to go to treatment, get my job back, but I'm not going to quit drinking and using. But I need to detox myself. And so I went back, and there was nobody in the motel. It was summertime. My mom was gone. And I started to detox myself. I quit drinking. And for whatever reason, I got really sick, and I started vomiting blood, and I'd drink water, and it would come back up blood. And my stomach got rock hard and distended, and I looked like a potato man. And so I'd been to an AA meeting, and I'd met a doctor and another guy, Herb. And I called Herb first, and he owned a restaurant up in Idlewild. And he said, "Come on up here right now." So I got in my old beat-up Volkswagen. I drove up to Idlewild, and I sat down at his restaurant table, and he had a room full of people that he was serving breakfast to. And he made me some chicken noodle soup, and gave me a glass of milk, and he said, "You're going to be all right, damn it. You're just an alcoholic, and you're going to get sober." And I remember thinking, shut up. Don't say that A word with all these people around here. And he was just insistent that, you're going to be all right. It's going to be okay. And it wasn't. I drank that milk, and it curdled in my stomach, and I remember thinking, I'm going to vomit. And the next thing I knew, I did, all over the table. And you want to clear out a restaurant? Vomit on the table. Pretty soon there wasn't anybody but he and I. And you know, it was interesting because he didn't miss a beat. He grabbed a towel, grabbed a trash can, scooped all that vomit into the, looked like cottage cheese, scooped it all into the trash can, never missed a beat, just headed on down the road. He said, "You're going to be all right. You're going to get sober." And I thought, what is wrong with this guy? I just ran all these people out of his restaurant, and he's worried about me getting sober. I'd met another guy, a physician, and when I got back down the hill, I called him and I told him what was going on, and he said, "Get into my office right away," and took me ahead of all of his other patients, which I really liked that kind of treatment, and took me back to the back and felt around a little bit, and he said, "We're going to try to save your life." And I thought, that's a little melodramatic, don't you think? But I really liked it because he gave me a shot of Demerol, and for the pancreatitis that I had, and he put me in the hospital, and he put me up at Desert Hospital on the 4th floor, and nice room, private room, and you know, it was great. And Demerol every 2 hours. Nurses come in, massage my back, feed me. I could have stayed there for years. But I started hallucinating, and I started hearing people, friends of mine from Oklahoma, coming through the intercom. And I remember at one point picking up the phone and telling the operator, you know, "I'm sorry, my friends from Oklahoma are screwing around with your intercom system." And she said, "Nobody's been on the intercom but me." And I said, "Yeah, I understand, but I'll take care of it." I thought she was just humoring me. Hung up. And I looked out the window, and I could see my friends out there in the parking lot. And so I had one of those. It was back in the days of the old bottle and, you know, IV, and I had that hooked up and open gown with no underwear on, and I got up and I wanted to go see my friends out in the parking lot. So I went out, punched the elevator, went down, opened up to the ICU waiting room, and here's all these people, you know, and I'm walking along, my ass hanging out, bottle clanging, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And I go out, and I remember going out the doors and rolling my little thing along the concrete, and then having to pick it up as I walked across the grass to the parking lot. And I got over the parking lot, and my friends weren't there. And I thought, well, this is weird. And obviously, I'd hallucinated them in the first place. But got back in the elevator, went back up, got in my bed. Eventually, and that doctor kept coming into my room every day, and he would sit at the foot of the bed, and he'd say, "Rocky, we're saving a bed for you over on the alcohol and drug treatment unit." And I'd say, "Now, Dr. Cargill, I think that I got this thing under control now. I think you can go ahead and give that bed to somebody else. I think I got this thing licked." And he'd just smile. And then one day he didn't show up, and a nurse did with a wheelchair. And they put me in the wheelchair, and they took me over to the alcohol and drug treatment unit. And it had just opened, and they were having some growing problems, and I was able to manipulate my way through there. And so I was in that hospital for a total of 48 days, 10 on the hooked up to IVs, and then 38 days in the treatment program. And I never let them get close to me. You know, once they started, I knew it was my turn for somebody to be poking around at my feelings, and I would shift the focus to somebody else. And so I left that treatment program with nothing, other than they'd forced me to go to those stupid AA meetings. And in those AA meetings, I had somehow gleaned some hope that there was a way for me to feel comfortable without using drugs and alcohol. And that was an important element of this, because I had to have that piece of it later on. And they had a commencement ceremony for me. They gave me a little medallion on my last day there, said nice stuff about me, made up a bunch of stuff. I said nice stuff about them, and I went straight to Thrifty's and I bought a gallon of wine. And I drank that wine for 3 days, did some cocaine. I remember by the time I got home, I was already drunk. And I remember it was Thanksgiving Day, and I walked into my mom's, and my mom and my nieces and nephews were there. They had a big turkey, and they were celebrating, and Rocky's coming out of treatment. And I remember feeling that sense of shame and the look in their eyes, you know, that look that you probably know when you look in the eyes of your loved ones and you see that pain and it hurt. And, you know, I felt just an absolute hatred of myself. And yet I didn't know what else to do. And I drank for 3 days, and finally I said, screw this, I'm out of here. And that snub-nosed revolver that I carried around, I stuck in my mouth and sat there for about 3 hours trying to decide whether to pull the trigger or not. And finally, you know, you put a gun in your mouth, and there's a lot of people up there that start having opinions about that. And I decided on a negotiated settlement. with the people in my head. And the negotiated settlement was that I was going to give this recovery thing 6 months. And I was really going to do it. I was going to get a sponsor. I was going to go to aftercare. I was going to go to meetings. I was going to work the steps. I was going to do the whole thing. I was going to start going to the gym and lifting weights, playing racquetball, doing the whole deal. But if it didn't work, if I didn't get to feel good without alcohol and drugs, then I was going to take that gun and I was going to go rob a pharmacy and get some good drugs, and when they caught me, which inevitably they would, then I was going to kill myself. It seemed to me like it was a premature suicide. I had one more party in me, so I needed it. So I went back into that treatment program, and it was the first time I cried. It was the first time I remember walking in there, and I remember saying, I give up. I'll do whatever you tell me to do. And you know, that was the start. That was the beginning. I started going to meetings. I got into aftercare. I started going to the gym. And ultimately what happened was I got the promises they had given me in those meetings. They said you could feel comfortable. And I remember driving down the road one day, and there was this sense that I had of completeness inside. And I hadn't done anything. I didn't have a girl, didn't have a job, nothing. And so what I found was that I could feel comfortable without doing alcohol and drugs. And that was a profound moment. You know, I remember I had my old beat-up Volkswagen with an AM radio, a broken speaker, no girlfriend, no money. I was making $3.33 as a nurse's aide trainee. And I remember driving along and having this sense of being complete for the first time in sobriety. I'd felt it in when I'd done alcohol and drugs, when I got it just right, when I got into that moment. But I hadn't used anything at all for 3 or 4 months. And I had this sense that everything was right. And yet I didn't have any of the things that I thought were going to make me happy. And that was an important moment, because I knew if I could get there once, I could get there again. If I could get there again, I could get there more thoroughly. And that was probably the defining moment. That was the moment when that negotiated settlement makes sense, because that was the moment that said this recovery thing works. I went from the stick being the motivator, I don't want to lose anymore, to all of a sudden the carrot was the motivator. I want to feel like this more. And that's going to have to happen for you. Because right now, the reason you're here is because you're going to lose your wife, your job, your health, something, or all of the above. But that ain't going to keep you here. That ain't going to keep you in recovery. At some point, that has to give way to the opportunity for change, the opportunity to feel comfortable inside, to feel complete, to feel whole. And that's the promise of recovery. And that's why we want you to go to those 12-step meetings, so that you get a frame of reference for that. So you understand how those 12 steps work. So you see people who've been clean and sober for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they're happy and they're contented. Their lives are different. They've changed. Because if you don't get that injection of hope, then you're always waiting for the injection of what you know works, whether it's speed, cocaine, and however you inject it, orally, through your nose, however you get it into your system is irrelevant. So you have a choice. You have a choice between what you know and what we offer you. And that's the choice that I had. And you have it today, and you'll decide today, and you'll decide tomorrow whether you're going to work this recovery program or you're going to go back to your disease in one form or another. And it's your decision, it's your choice. Thanks.